But what I want to talk about, and something that we need to talk about now, because it has not been called to the attention of the American people, and that about the great work that's being done in this administration to better our environment. Now, when you say that perhaps it could be argued that the Trump administration may go down as one of the truly great environmental administrations, nobody will believe that. You know, I've never seen a president in my lifetime, in my history, that is so detested by members of the media. So people consequently don't know, with the exception of a few of the tweets. Now, I admit that I cringe a little bit when I hear a new tweet coming out, but look, if that's the only way you can get the truth out, it's something that has worked and it's been very effective. Now, we have a White House dedicated to clean air, land, and water by cutting excessive duplicative regulations. Based on what you see in the media, you'd think the president turned his back on the environment, but it's been just the opposite. We're seeing significant progress in environmental protection that we have not seen in any other administration. Americans should know the truth about how this administration is leading the world in environmental gains. People say, well, you can't do that. That can't be done. You can't increase economic activity at the same time making environmental gains. But that is actually happening. Now, look at the chart we have behind me. There's a couple of facts that most Americans really don't know. They have no way of knowing until now. That is, since 1970, combined emissions of the 6 common pollutants. Now, we're talking about the recognized 6 common pollutants that are out there. It says that emissions dropped by 74%, while the U.S. economy grew by 275%. Now, is that possible that could happen? Well, it did happen, because there it is right there. All this economic activity and all this growth, and yet the bottom line there are the emissions, the aggregate emissions of the 6 common pollutants. There they are, going down. It's because this administration knows what this administration is doing and has a commitment that other people are not aware of. Now, look at CO2. We had debates over the years about whether or not CO2 is one of the pollutants. It's not one of the 6 common pollutants, but nonetheless, it's the one that people seem to be looking at. Since 2005, the United States energy-related CO2 emissions fell by 14%, while global energy-related CO2 emissions increased by over 20%. Now, we're talking about all of the emission increase, and we had a reduction. And despite this drop in emissions, in 2018, the United States became the world's leading producer of oil and natural gas and net exporter of oil and natural gas, fossil fuels, for the first time in 75 years. Now, I'm particularly proud of this. I'm from an oil state, the state of Oklahoma. I know how many jobs are tied to it. I know what's happened to our economy, and a lot of that can be attributed to using the proper energy sources that we have available to us. Now, this administration has proven that we don't have to impose massive tax increases or regulatory burdens on American families in order to reduce pollution. We're reducing pollution, clearly. The Democrats often say the United States is failing to properly reduce carbon emissions, and this just isn't true. Look at the chart number 2. The reality is that CO2 emissions have been falling. If you look at the chart, in 2017, the United States led the world in CO2 emissions reductions, while notably China led emissions. Now, you got to look at this. The top line is the United States. That is a reduction. We're leading the world in reductions of CO2 emissions. The very bottom, in the bottom one, China is all the way across the bottom of the page. That's the largest of the increases in emissions of CO2. Now, what a contrast that is. That defies everything else that you read about, and yet there it is. That's the truth. I always think about this. A lot of people are not aware that there is a big party that takes place every December. It's happening now. It's happened now for, 21, maybe 22 years? Is that right? That's when you get 180 countries together, and they all talk about what they're going to do to reduce CO2 emissions. And so we see who is and who is not reducing CO2 emissions with this chart. Well, they talked about this great Paris Accord that this president wisely took us out of, and what that did was it had these countries line up, and they had India and China, who between the two of them are responsible for 1/4 of all the emissions of CO2. And at that time, their obligation was to continue doing what they're doing with coal-fired plants until 2025. Then they will consider reducing their emissions. Well, what kind of a commitment is that? Meanwhile, our president at that time was President Obama, and President Obama made commitments that could not be kept by our country. And yet, stop and think, we don't need to do it. Look, we're already doing it. Just look what we're doing right now in our emissions. And people don't know that. Well, anyway, China and India represent almost half of all the global carbon emissions. We just don't hear this in the news. And that's why we need to be talking about it. Another thing I bet most people don't know is that in the early 1970s, more than 40% of America's drinking water systems failed basic health standards. But today, 93% of the systems meet all health standards all the time. In fact, the United States is ranked #1 in the world for clean drinking water. And clearly, this president's environmental policies are working. You would think environmentalists and Democrats would be praising our president given these undeniable successes. But instead, they're pushing for the Green New Deal. We've all heard about the Green New Deal, what it's going to be doing. It's a little $93 trillion program that's being promoted by a lot of the liberals around this environment here in Washington. The authors of this Green New Deal spend 4 pages painting the scary and inaccurate picture of our environment. Then they spend the next 9 pages outlining their socialist agenda aimed at ensuring the government dictates life in America from the car you drive to the energy that you consume. They talk about, in the Green New Deal, eliminating air traffic. Well, that's very nice. I don't know how people get around, but they want to also eliminate beef. I happen to be from a beef state, and we like beef. But apparently these people think that things that cows do that make noise don't smell good. And so they want to eliminate beef. They eliminate oil and gas altogether. You can't eliminate oil and gas. Right now we're dependent upon 80% of our energy that we use to enjoy life in America comes from oil and gas. And it's going to continue. We're not going to see it changing in the near future. So scientists like MIT's Richard Lindzen have been calling out climate alarmists for years on this conspiracy to control our lives. This flawed plan doesn't take into account that over 80% of the United States energy comes from fossil fuels. 80%. Now, you eliminate fossil fuels, how do you run this machine called America? The answer is you can't. Our nation runs on American coal, oil, and gas, and that isn't going to change anytime soon. We had a vote in the Senate on this radical Green New Deal plan, but not a single Democrat was willing to vote for it. A lot of them voted present. They didn't want to get on record voting for it, and yet that's what they're promoting over in the House. They know that their plan won't work and is extremely unpopular, so they weren't going to join it. So, anytime you don't want to vote for something or vote against something, what do? You vote present. Well, anyway, I didn't think the Democrats could be more radical than they were under the Obama administration, but I was wrong. I at least give the Obama administration credit for being honest about its radical war on fossil fuels. For 8 years, President Obama targeted oil and gas producers in states like my state of Oklahoma, but President Obama lost that fight. And Oklahoma energy producers continued to create thousands of jobs to fuel this machine called America. I think back to 1990, because I was here in 1990, and that's when we passed a landmark piece of legislation called the Clean Air Act. I co-sponsored that act, and that succeeded in reducing acid rain, air pollution, and harm to our ozone layer. It's gone down in history as one of the true great successes that has happened in this country in terms of the environment. And we're all a part of this, and we've been successful. Now, many of today's Democrats are virtually unrecognizable compared to those back in 1990. I urge my Democratic colleagues to reject radical socialist environmental policies, come back to reality, and support our president's very effective approach. I'm proud of President Trump and his administration's record on improving our nation's environment while streamlining government overreach. It is possible to have a thriving economy while safeguarding our air and water. And I would, again, ask you to go back and look at this. Look at the chart, the other one, the blue one. No, the other one. And just look and see what we have done and where we are. In spite of what you hear, we are the ones, we are the country under this administration that is going to go down and be recognized as one of the truly great environmental administrations. And I'm very proud of that, and I think it's time that people know it.